Anderson Street to Melrose Street, the Wes Davis Greenway is a 0.8-mile tribute to the man affectionately known as Mr. Bristol. While not originally from Bristol, Wes Davis would spend the majority of his life serving its people in several different forms, from the mayor to city councilman and all-around good neighbor.
He was born in Selma, Alabama in 1910. His parents moved to Bristol in 1915 when he was 5. He was the only child at that point. She later had 2 more children. But they lived in Bristol from 1915 until he died.
Davis attended King College, where he would eventually graduate as an honors student. Even in school, he was always wanting to help in any way he could.
He said he was too small to play sports, so he was a cheerleader / water boy for the football team.
It was clear that early on in his life, Wes Davis had a genuine love of helping others. While attending King College, he decided to leave and join the military to serve his country during World War II. Ultimately, his service in the military would lay the groundwork for his long charitable career.
He was at King College and had to leave college and join the war. He didn't have to, but he joined the war. Joined the Army Air Force is what he was in. Later, they divided then, I guess, to the Army and the Air Force. But he went to Officers Candidate School in Florida, and following that, his orders were to report to Post Office Box 651 in Tracy, California. Nobody in Tracy knew what was going on, but several miles from Tracy was a place called Byron, California, and there was a hot springs there. There was a big resort at Byron Hot Springs. A lot of actors and actresses would go there and party and play and enjoy the hot springs and drink, because, you know, that was during Prohibition. You couldn't get a drink anywhere but someplace like that. So the Army took it over to interrogate Japanese prisoners. They would go to Angel Island in California and then take them to Byron Hot Springs. And he didn't speak Japanese, but I read a book about Byron Hot Springs recently, and they would always interrogate the prisoners with a civilian Japanese American and a military person. They were very good to the Japanese prisoners. I know that they were treated very well. And they thought that Byron Hot Springs would be the good place for them because the Japanese would perhaps feel more at home and eager to open up and talk because of the hot springs and the resort like atmosphere that they had. But he was stationed there. He said he figured that the people wondered what the boxcars with rice in them were for, but I talked to my aunt just the other night, and we talked about it again, and she's still in California, and she said nobody ever knew. And Daddy never talked about that. The only thing he ever said was that he reported to a post office box and that there was a lot of rice going, and that he coming and going, and that he was an interrogator with military intelligence, but he never got any more specific than that. And apparently the men were not allowed at all to talk about it. My aunt said no one had any idea what they were doing out at, they called it Camp Tracy actually, but that's where he met my mother. He met her at a dance, and she thought his combat boots were pretty awful looking, but the fact is 6 weeks later they got married, and he was transferred then to the Pentagon. The rest of his outfit went to the Pacific, which is where he thought he would end up, but instead he was sent to the Pentagon, and he stayed there until 1945 when he got out of the Army, and they came back to Bristol in 1945.
After returning from the service in 1945, Davis settled back into Bristol, where he opened his business, Davis Tire and Recapping.
That year he also built a business, and he owned a tire store for many years, Davis Tire and Recapping, and his slogan was "The Man Behind the Tennessee Post Office." And years later, when we moved to the house that I lived in for a very long time, it was up on a big hill, and every time it snowed, Mother and I would wait at the window and watch, because we knew that he was going to gun the car and get up that hill or not, because his other slogan was, "You go in snow or we pay the tow." And he'd have died trying to get up that hill, you know.
Thanks to his local efforts, Wes Davis quickly became known in the city and was well on his way to earning his nickname of Mr. Bristol.
His name was certainly out there, I guess you'd say, because he was involved. I read in this diary that he wrote, he was in the Civitan Club, and he helped my grandmother on the clothing drive for the men coming out of the service, and he was involved with, he was chairman of the men that did the collection at the church, and he was always involved with the Boy Scouts. He served in office that year in the American Legion, and they had an American Legion, a veterans group that he became involved with. So he was always busy doing something else for somebody. And all the while he was building his business. But I think that that was probably the very beginning of his civic work. And like I said, from that it led into his interest in politics. My mother said to him one time, "You know, I could take Pat and go back to California and you'd never miss us because all you do is go to meetings." And he said, "Well, you know what, Maybelle? That's my only hobby." And it was. That civic work was his hobby. He ran for mayor in 1965 when it was still a mayor and 2 commissioners. He was elected. I graduated from high school and he was elected mayor. And then in '69 he was to run again and was defeated that time. He was very much in favor of the city commission and commissioner of finance and commissioner of streets. He liked that form of city government better than the city council form, which they began to talk about in 1969. Later, when I was older and married, he ran for city council again and was elected, and I believe he served 2 terms that time. He ran one time for the school board, but he was defeated with that. But he loved it. He loved Bristol. I almost said about as much as he loved Mom and me, but he really did love Bristol. He loved the people here. I know that there are people still today who will say to me, "I remember your dad, and he was so kind to me when I had something going on." And in his later years, he worked for the Sheltered Workshop, which is now part of Frontier Health, and he loved dealing with the folks at the Sheltered Workshop and helping it grow. I said he was there. He begged, borrowed, and probably tried to steal for the Sheltered Workshop. You know, they needed money, and he went out and he was the director of development. I think they made up the title, but he loved Bristol. My grandmother was he was a lot like his mother. She was always involved in something, you know, and so he took that and built on it. And he loved a disaster. He would have been right in heaven last week with the rain and the snow. He did a lot of work with the Red Cross. He was the disaster chairman at one time, and he had this awful blue pith helmet that he wore with this blue jumpsuit. But anytime there was something bad going on, he wanted to be right there and see what he could do to help. He took Mother and me one time on a little drive through Southwest Virginia when, years ago, they had a terrible flood. And we went over to Pound, I remember, and saw the devastation over there. And, you know, that was another thing that he always tried to be involved in and help folks.
Davis was also an esteemed member of the Kiwanis Club, where he served several different positions and held a track record like no other.
You know, people don't get that involved in as many things now, I think. You know, I'm sure because of the remark Mother made, he probably stretched himself pretty thin with all the things he was involved with. I know, you know, years later he was a member of the Kiwanis Club, and he served every office, local and state, in Kiwanis. He was very involved with the Legion and the 40 and 8, the Boy Scouts, 4-H, his church, the Red Cross. You know, was dedicated to a life of service, I suppose you'd say. And that's why I guess he got the title of Mr. Bristol. I really don't, probably because he had his hands in so many things. And one of the best things he ever did too, he was the best Santa's helper you'd ever see. Every Christmas Eve for many, many years, I remember we spent our Christmas Eve going to folks' houses, and he would go in his Santa suit and surprise people, being Santa Claus. And that's how we spent our Christmas Eve for many, many, even when I was little, he would do that. And then carried it on to when I had children, and you know. But he went to one man's house one night, one Christmas Eve, and just as he knocked on the door, he heard the man say, "Now, kids, you've got to go on home." His grandchildren lived next door. And he said, "Kids, you've got to go on home. That could be Santa right now." And he opened the door, and there was Santa Claus standing there, you know. So that's just something else that he wanted to do. And he started out going to see his friends who had small children. And then as it got known that he was doing that, people would call him before Christmas and say, "Could you come by my house? And could you, you know," and so he always had a list of where all he was going to go. Mother drove, and when he was mayor the first time, the police drove him around one year. So he went to Tennessee Ernie's house. His mom and dad lived on the old Bluntville Highway, and he knew that Ernie Ford was in town that Christmas, and he had two sons, and they were young, and so he thought he'd go out there. He didn't know he was coming. Daddy knocked on the door, and they were all surprised. There was Santa Claus, you know, and as he got ready to leave, Ernie tried to slip him some money, and Daddy said, "No, no, 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 you don't recognize, you know," he said, "You don't recognize who I am." But he loved to surprise people like that. That was neat.
After his death in 1993, plans were soon arranged for the construction of the Greenway in honor of his memory, the one and only Mr. Bristol.
He would have been very proud of the Greenway that they built in his memory. And I thought it was fitting that they did the train insignia and then have the train cars there, because his father worked for the Southern Railway. He was a machinist with the Southern Railway shop. So it would have been special to my grandfather as well as to Daddy that was put there in his memory.
Always an optimist, Davis recounts the events of New Year's Eve in 1946, a perfect insight to the man he was.
I think it's interesting what he wrote in this diary the last day of 1946. He said, "Here 'tis last day of year, and weather is still warmer than last year at this time." He wrote about my grandparents from California were here, and they were going to leave on Sunday. He said, "In many ways, this hasn't been such a bad year. Our debts are few, and we have invested some dollars in a home. Business has started out good and looks okay, but with more effort for 1947. Tonight I acted as a Toastmaster at the New Year's Eve party for the young people at the church. Mother cooked the meal, about 150 in attendance. Came home about 10, got Maybelle. We went over to some friend's house to see the old year out. Back home about 1 a.m. and to bed, hoping and praying 1947 will be as good as 1946. President Truman just declared the end of the war."